History feared kings, but it underestimated the women who could reach them when nobody else could, because some women didn't need armies. They needed access, a confession, a letter at midnight. And the first woman tonight didn't simply influence a throne. She helped remove the man sitting on it. So the real question isn't who ruled. It's who was allowed close enough to decide what ruled even meant. When people hear the word asterisk, dangerous asterisk in royal history, they imagine poison rings, daggers behind curtains, and women smiling while plotting murder. But that's not usually how royal danger works. The most dangerous women near a throne were rarely dangerous because they were violent. They were dangerous because they were asterisk, close enough to hear what ministers never heard, close enough to influence what generals could not influence, close enough to touch the one thing every monarchy depends on, but almost never admits out loud: the private mind of the sovereign. In a court, power is not a single object, it's a network. The crown is simply the symbol that convinces everyone the network has a center, but the real center is access. Who gets the first conversation of the day? Who gets the last conversation of the night? Who is allowed to speak without an appointment? Who can enter when the king is tired, sick, humiliated, or afraid? Those moments are where decisions are born, not in the formal council chamber, not in the grand hall where portraits stare down at history, but in the quiet rooms where a monarch stops performing and becomes briefly human. So in this video, dangerous does not mean morally evil in a cartoon way. It means strategically lethal. It means a woman whose presence changes outcomes, wars, alliances, successions, reputations, and the careers of men who believed they were running the state. And the reason these women mattered is simple. Monarchies are built on a contradiction. Kings are supposed to be above everyone. Yet kings are also intensely vulnerable, because one person cannot govern alone. A ruler depends on intermediaries, secretaries, favorites, priests, physicians, mothers, spouses, lovers, people who become the funnel between the throne and reality. Whoever controls the funnel controls the kingdom. There are three main levers that make a woman dangerous near a throne, and you'll see every one of them repeated across centuries, countries, and dynasties. The first lever is asterisk. Asterisk, access, asterisk. Physical access, emotional access, and timing. Access is a political resource. Being in the bedchamber does not just mean intimacy, it means presence during weakness. It means hearing what the king says when he is not being watched. It means the ability to interrupt, to soothe, to provoke, to delay, or to accelerate. In courts, timing is everything. One whispered sentence can arrive 5 minutes before a minister enters and change the entire tone of a meeting. One tear at the right moment can make a policy feel personal. And because monarchy is theatrical, because image is stability, anything that changes the monarch's emotional state can change the nation's direction. That is why favorites were feared. Not because they held official titles, but because they had the one privilege that makes official titles almost secondary. They could reach the king when other people could not. The second lever is asterisk. Asterisk information. Asterisk, asterisk. Courts are information machines. Letters travel. Rumors breed. Ambassadors listen. Servants observe. Physicians diagnose. Confessors hear sins that are never written down. And the most powerful information is not always state secrets. Sometimes it's asterisk, human secrets asterisk. A fear, a shame, a dependency, a weakness. The knowledge of who is sleeping with whom. The knowledge of who is in debt. The knowledge of what the king truly thinks about his own ministers. Once you know those things, you can predict behavior. And once you can predict behavior, you can steer it. This is why courts produced endless scandals that were not really about morality at all. Scandal was a form of currency. It could be exchanged for silence, promotion, exile, or survival. The third lever is seconds gatekeeping. Control over who gets what, and who gets near whom. In most monarchies, decisions happen through appointments and favors. Who becomes a minister? Who receives a title? Whose family gets a marriage alliance? Who is allowed to approach the sovereign? Who is kept waiting? Who is humiliated in public? A woman near a throne could become a gatekeeper without ever being named as one. Ministers would find their requests stalled. Rivals would discover doors closing softly in their faces. Ambassadors would learn that the quickest way to a king's attention was not through a council, but through someone the council pretended to dismiss. And that is what makes this kind of power so difficult to fight. It is informal, plausible, and deniable. If you accuse a woman of controlling the king, you risk sounding paranoid, insulting, or immoral. And if you're wrong, you ruin yourself. If you're right, you still might ruin yourself, because you are accusing the sovereign of being controlled, which is practically an act of treason in a culture built on the idea of royal mastery. Now, it's important to say something clearly. These women did not operate in a vacuum. Many of them were not lone masterminds doing everything by themselves. They were often the visible face of factions, families, religious groups, political networks, using proximity as a weapon. But what makes an individual woman dangerous is her ability to make those factions functional. She becomes the interface, the translator between desire and policy, the person who can turn a private emotion into a public outcome. And that's why courts tolerated them, often even when they hated them, because monarchs needed them, not always for love, sometimes for comfort, stability, advice, flattery, or the feeling of being understood in a life where everyone else spoke in rehearsed language. A king can have 100 servants and still be lonely. A king can have a council and still feel misunderstood. So when someone becomes the place a monarch rests, emotionally, they become politically unavoidable. Remove them, and you don't just remove a person, you destabilize the sovereign's private world. And a destabilized sovereign is the most dangerous thing in any kingdom. This is also why so many women near thrones were attacked, not with swords, but with stories. They were called witches, whores, foreign vipers, poisoners, corrupters of youth, because the fastest way to neutralize informal power is to make it socially unacceptable. If you can't arrest it, you can shame it. If you can't prove it, you can stain it. And once the public believes a woman is the reason the king is failing, she becomes a lightning rod. Sometimes that was fair, often it was convenient, always it was political. So as we move through the 5 women in this video, keep one question in your mind. What did each of them control that others could not? Was it the king's emotions? Was it the flow of information? Was it access to appointments and favors? Was it the succession itself? Because the most dangerous thing you can be near a throne is not a villain. It is a filter, a person who decides what reality reaches the sovereign and what reality dies in the corridor. And the first woman we're meeting tonight is not simply an influence. She is one of the clearest demonstrations that proximity can become regime change, because she didn't just bend policy, or ruin a minister, or whisper into a king's ear. She helped remove the man sitting on the throne. And once you understand how that was possible, you'll never look at a queen consort the same way again. If you want to understand what dangerous really means near a throne, don't start with a woman who influenced a king. Start with a woman who helped remove one. Isabella of France arrived in England in 1308 as a teenager, married to Edward II. On paper, it was one of those glittering medieval alliances that looked unbreakable. A French princess, a Plantagenet king, peace sealed by ceremony. But royal marriages don't collapse in public first. They collapse in private, one humiliation at a time, until the humiliation becomes policy. Edward II had a weakness that wasn't just personal. It was political favorites. The court knew it. The barons knew it. And Isabella, watching from inside the marriage, learned the most brutal lesson any queen can learn. If your husband's loyalty is for sale, then your safety is never guaranteed. First came Piers Gaveston, Edward's intimate favorite, whose influence enraged the nobility and became a national crisis. Gaveston was eventually executed in 1312, but removing one favorite didn't remove the system that produced favorites. It only created a vacancy. Later, the Despensers, Hugh Despenser the Younger and his father, rose into that space and became far more dangerous, because they didn't just enjoy the king's affection, They turned it into administration, land seizures, patronage, punishment, the slow choking out of anyone who stood in their way, and Isabella the Queen became inconvenient. By the early 1320s, it wasn't merely that she was ignored, she was actively undermined. Her household was interfered with, her allies were threatened, her position, the traditional role of a queen as mediator and stabilizer, was hollowed out from the inside. In a medieval monarchy, a queen's power often sits in soft places: intercession, patronage, public symbolism, the ability to calm factions. But when the king's inner circle views her as a rival to be neutralized, those soft places become traps. Then the marriage cracked into something sharper: fear, because the dispensers, protected by the king, could move against her without consequences. And that meant Isabella was no longer simply a wife in a miserable marriage. She was a political figure, living inside a hostile regime, watching the corridor narrow, watching the doors close, realizing quietly that if she waited long enough, she might not survive the waiting. This is the point where Isabella's danger begins to take shape, not as an emotion, but as a decision. She would stop trying to be the queen they wanted, and become the queen they feared. In 1325, she was sent to France on a diplomatic mission. Officially, it was about negotiations and obligations. Unofficially, it gave her what she hadn't had for years: breathing space. And once she had breathing space, she did something that looks simple but is psychologically irreversible. She refused to return. That refusal wasn't a tantrum. It was a message to every faction watching: the queen has stepped outside the king's control. And in a monarchy, that is not just marital rebellion, it is a crack in sovereignty. In France, Isabella aligned herself with a man who would become inseparable from her story: Roger Mortimer. Mortimer was not a romantic figure in the modern sense. He was a political instrument, and also potentially a partner in something far larger than scandal: regime change. Together they gathered support among English exiles and enemies of the dispensers. They built a coalition out of grievance, ambition, and exhaustion, because by that point, Edward II's reign was not simply unpopular, it was unstable. Then came the move that makes Isabella one of the most terrifying women ever allowed near a throne. She returned to England not as a queen pleading for reconciliation, but as a leader of an invasion. In September 1326, Isabella landed with Mortimer and a small force, but the force didn't need to be large, because something else was already in place: England's willingness to turn. The speed of Edward II's collapse is part of what makes this story so disturbing. A monarchy is meant to be a structure that holds during storms. Yet the moment Isabella arrived, the storm became the structure. Cities and nobles rallied. The king's support melted. The dispensers fled, hunted now by the same political tide they once controlled. And when the dispensers were captured, the violence of the reckoning was deliberate. Hugh Despenser the Younger was executed in November 1326, brutally, as a public declaration that the inner regime had been ripped out. This is how revolution communicates in a world without newspapers: through bodies, through spectacle, through the unmistakable message that the rules have changed. But Isabella's real target wasn't a favorite, it was the crown. Edward II was captured, and within months he was forced to abdicate. In January 1327, the throne passed to his son Edward III. Still a boy, the handover looked clean: a lawful transfer, a kingdom stabilized. But the truth was darker. The country now had a child king, and therefore a vacuum. And vacuums get filled. Isabella and Mortimer filled it. This is where the story becomes less like a dramatic coup, and more like a warning about the mechanics of proximity. Isabella had not taken the throne for herself in a formal sense. She didn't wear the crown as sovereign, but she controlled the system around it. She had become the gatekeeper to the child king. She had become the filter through which government moved. She had effectively turned her access into a regency that felt, to many observers, like rule. And in that moment, the title she-wolf begins to make sense, not as an objective description, but as political branding. When a woman becomes too powerful in a world that insists power is male, the world does not simply oppose her, it mythologizes her. It animalizes her. It tries to make her influence sound unnatural, so that removing her feels like restoring nature itself. But here is the twist that makes Isabella's story so perfect for this video. Her danger didn't vanish when she succeeded. It evolved, because ruling through a child king is a temporary arrangement. Children grow up, and when Edward III became old enough to understand what had been done in his name, he did what monarchies often do when they reclaim their autonomy. He struck at the gatekeeper. In October 1330, Edward III moved against Mortimer. Mortimer was arrested and executed. Isabella was pushed aside, removed from the center of power. Not killed, her blood and status mattered too much for that, but contained. The corridor that had once closed around her enemies now closed around her. And that ending is the quiet, brutal truth behind her entire arc. Proximity can overthrow a king, but it cannot protect you forever. The throne tolerates influence only while it is useful. Once it becomes threatening, it corrects the imbalance. So why does Isabella matter? Because she proves a queen can be near the throne and still change the entire definition of rule. She shows that a royal marriage can become a political battlefield. She shows how soft power, public image, foreign alliances, access to the air can harden into something that looks like conquest. And she leaves us with the most dangerous question of all. If a queen can help remove a king, how many other queens, mothers and favorites changed history in quieter ways, without armies, without landings, without open rebellion? Because Isabella broke the crown with movement. The next woman we meet broke kingdoms by turning religion into a weapon, through marriages, court factions and a single wedding that became a trapdoor into bloodshed. And once you see how Catherine de' Medici operated inside of France on the edge of civil war, you'll understand why some courts didn't fear invasion nearly as much as they feared the wrong woman in the wrong room at the wrong time. If Isabella shows you how a woman can break a crown through movement and timing, Catherine de' Medici shows you something colder. How a woman can keep a dynasty alive by treating an entire country like a chessboard, especially when every piece on that board is soaked in religion, fear, and revenge. Catherine was born into the Medici family in Florence, the kind of name that already carried a warning label in Renaissance Europe: money, influence, and a talent for surviving enemies. She arrived in France as a teenager and married Henry, Duke of Orléans, in 1533. It was a political marriage arranged to bind France to Italian power. But Catherine's early years at court were not a triumph. For a long time she was not the center of the king's heart, and for a long time she did not look like the center of the dynasty's future. She had to learn patience, and in royal history, patience is often the most lethal skill of all. Her husband became Henry II in 1547, and Catherine became queen consort. But even then her influence was limited by one humiliating fact. The court adored Diane de Poitiers, Henry's mistress, and Diane held the kind of private power that can make a lawful wife feel like a decorative symbol. Catherine watched this dynamic for years, and she learned something that will matter for the rest of this video. Official titles do not automatically grant real control. Access does. Then Henry II died suddenly in 1559, after a tournament accident, and the political ground shifted beneath Catherine's feet. Her eldest son, Francis II, became king. But he was young and fragile, and he died in 1560. Then her next son, Charles IX, took the throne. Also young, also vulnerable. That moment is where Catherine's danger becomes undeniable, because she did not just become a mother, she became the stabilizing center of a collapsing system. In a period when France was tearing itself apart, a child king meant regency influence, and regency influence meant the ability to decide who lives, who rises, and which version of France survives. To understand Catherine, you have to understand the world she ruled. 16th century France was not dealing with a polite disagreement over theology. It was living through the French wars of religion. Catholics and Huguenots, locked in cycles of violence, conspiracy and revenge. Noble houses built private armies. Towns split into factions. The state became a fragile theater, where every public gesture could trigger bloodshed. In that environment, the crown's job was not merely to govern, it was to prevent the country from dissolving. And Catherine's power came from the fact that she stood at the center of the most unstable triangle imaginable: a young king, militant factions, and a dynasty that could be swallowed by civil war if it appeared weak. This is where the story becomes uncomfortable, because when you read about Catherine, you're often tempted to categorize her quickly: monster or mastermind, villain or savior. But Catherine does not fit neatly into that. Her danger was not theatrical cruelty. It was strategic decision-making in a world where every decision produced corpses. She was the kind of political mind that could look at two terrible options and choose the one that preserved the throne, then live with the cost. The core of Catherine's method was leverage through balance. She tried at different points to prevent one side from gaining enough dominance to destroy the other, because if one side won completely, the crown would lose control of the country. She used negotiations. She used marriages. She used patronage. She used concessions. But she also understood that peace in a civil war is sometimes only a pause between massacres, and pauses can be used. That brings us to the turning point that still hangs over her reputation like a shadow: the marriage of 1572. In August 1572, Paris hosted a wedding designed to look like reconciliation itself. Marguerite de Valois, Catherine's daughter, married Henry of Navarre, a leading Protestant figure who would later become Henry IV of France. On paper, it was a diplomatic miracle, Catholic and Protestant bloodlines joining, a symbolic attempt to stitch France back together. But weddings in royal history are not just romance and ceremony. They are gatherings of power, and power gatherings can become traps. Thousands of Huguenots came to Paris for the celebrations. They were visible, they were concentrated, they were, in the eyes of their enemies, within reach. Then on the 24th of August 1572, St. Bartholomew's Day, the city exploded into violence. The massacre began in Paris and spread. Targets were hunted. Bodies filled streets. It became one of the most infamous eruptions of religious violence in European history, and Catherine de' Medici's name has been tied to it ever since, often as the figure who engineered the disaster. Here's what matters for our story. Regardless of how you interpret the precise chain of decisions, whether it began as a targeted strike against leaders that spiraled, or as a planned act that was unleashed, this is the moment where Catherine's danger becomes something Europe could feel, because it proved that the throne could treat faith as a security problem. It proved that royal policy could turn into mass death overnight. And it proved that behind the glittering surface of a wedding, the court was capable of using celebration as camouflage. Why would a woman do this? That is the question that holds the viewer. And the answer is where Catherine becomes most unsettling. She was not acting only as an individual. She was acting as the dynasty's nerve center. She had watched France fracture. She had watched Protestant and Catholic nobles behave like rival governments. She had watched threats multiply around a young king, and at some point she concluded that letting the crown appear passive was more dangerous than letting it appear ruthless. In a world where weakness invites assassination, mercy can look like surrender, and Catherine understood image. She understood that the crown survives by looking decisive even when it is scared. But here's the retentive, human twist. Catherine's danger wasn't just what she did, it was what she had to live with afterwards. Because once violence reaches a certain scale, it becomes its own language. It teaches people new expectations. It normalizes brutality. It creates factions that feed on trauma. And from that point onwards, every attempt to stabilize the kingdom is haunted by the knowledge that the crown has crossed a line. That is why Catherine de' Medici belongs in this list, not because she was a cartoon villain, but because she demonstrates the most terrifying form of proximity power: the ability to shift a nation's direction through a single decision made inside a palace, then watch the outside world burn with the consequences. And yet, for all her ruthless statecraft, Catherine's power is still recognizably political: religion, factions, dynastic survival. The next woman is different, because Diane de Poitiers did not need civil war to shape the state. She only needed one man's devotion, and the speed with which devotion becomes policy in a royal court is exactly why love, real or performed, can be one of the most dangerous forces ever allowed near a throne. Diane de Poitiers is proof that in a royal court, romance is never just romance. It is a pipeline, A private corridor that bypasses ministers, councils, and laws, and delivers influence straight into the mind of the king. And what made Diane genuinely dangerous wasn't that she loved power in the abstract. It's that she understood something most people at court refused to admit out loud. A king can be surrounded by advisors and still be emotionally owned by one person. Diane was born in 1499 into French nobility, and by the time she entered the orbit of the Valois court, she had already learned how to survive in a world that rewarded beauty, but punished women who seemed to wield it too openly. She was intelligent, disciplined, and remarkably skilled at projecting control. When Henry, Duke of Orléans, the future Henry II, was still young, Diane became part of his world, and over time she became something far more intimate than a court companion. She became a constant, a stabilizing figure in the one environment where stability hardly existed. The age difference between them is often mentioned because it makes the relationship sound either scandalous or maternal, depending on who is telling the story. But in political terms, the detail matters for a simpler reason. It suggests that Henry's attachment to Diane was not just passion, it was dependence, and dependence is one of the strongest forms of power a person can hold over a monarch, because it doesn't require orders, it requires presence. When Henry II became king in 1547, Diane's position stopped being a private detail and became an open secret with national consequences. Catherine de' Medici was queen consort by law, but Diane functioned as a queen of access, and access in monarchy is not a metaphor. It is the difference between being heard and being decorative. Diane could enter the king's space without the ritual barriers that other people faced. She could frame questions, she could soften anger, she could push resentment, she could deliver a name into his mind at exactly the moment a decision was forming. Courts try to pretend these dynamics are superficial. They call them scandals. They whisper about influence as if it's merely social. But the mechanism is brutally practical. A king decides who gets appointments. A king decides which voices feel trustworthy. A king decides who will be punished and who will be protected. When a woman can shape those instincts, she is not an ornament. She is a political instrument. One of the clearest signals of Diane's power is how visible it became in the culture of the court itself. Henry's imagery repeatedly blended his identity with hers, most famously through intertwined symbols and monograms that appeared in decoration and patronage. In a world obsessed with dynastic symbolism, that is not a minor aesthetic choice. It is a public acknowledgement that the king's private loyalty had become part of his official self. It told courtiers that if they wanted to understand the king, they needed to understand Diane, and once a court believes that, influence becomes self-reinforcing. People begin to orbit the perceived center of gravity. Petitioners seek Diane's favor. Rival nobles attempt to win her goodwill. Ministers learn to speak in ways that will not offend her. Even those who despise her still have to calculate around her, because ignoring her influence becomes a career mistake. This is where Diane becomes dangerous in the specific sense we defined earlier. She could affect gatekeeping. She could shape patronage. She could help decide which men rose and which men vanished into political darkness. And she did it with the kind of elegance that makes informal power look natural rather than imposed. That matters because the easiest way to destroy a favorite is to make them look like a problem. The hardest favorites to remove are the ones who appear to be part of the king's identity itself. But here's the human side that makes the story feel real rather than mechanical. Diane's power depended entirely on one fragile condition: Henry staying alive and Henry staying attached. And royal attachment is not protected by law, it is protected by psychology. The moment the king's psychology changes, the entire structure collapses. That collapse came abruptly in 1559. Henry II was injured in a tournament, one of those public spectacles designed to display royal strength, and the injury turned fatal. The detail is important because it reveals the cruelty of monarchy. The same rituals meant to glorify a king can kill him, and when he dies, the unofficial queen's power dies with him. The moment Henry was gone, Catherine de' Medici's patience ended. Catherine had spent years watching her legal position undermined by Diane's functional position. She had endured the humiliation that comes from being the queen in public while feeling powerless in private. And once she became the dominant figure at court, she moved with speed. Diane was pushed aside, her access cut off, her influence severed. This is one of the most instructive things about court power. It can look permanent until the day it suddenly isn't. The court does not gradually take away access. It closes doors. Diane's story is dangerous not only because of what she did while she held power, but because of what her fall demonstrates. It shows how quickly a kingdom's informal center can shift. It shows that the most influential figures can be erased in an afternoon once the conditions that supported them disappear. And it shows, in a way that feels almost brutal, that proximity is the most powerful form of power, and also the least secure. Now here is the question that should linger as we leave Diane. If romance can redirect an entire state, what happens when romance becomes an economy? When access to the king isn't just emotional influence, but a marketplace of titles, money, and humiliation. Because the next woman on our list didn't merely shape the king's choices, she turned the court itself into a transaction. And in Restoration England, where indulgence and power mixed openly, Barbara Palmer would prove that the throne can be controlled not only through love, but through appetite, and the price paid for satisfying it. If Diane de Poitiers shows how devotion becomes policy, Barbara Palmer shows how desire becomes an economy, because Restoration England wasn't a court pretending to be holy. It was a court that had survived collapse, exile, and civil war, and returned with a kind of hungry confidence, as if pleasure itself had become proof that the monarchy was alive again. And in that atmosphere, Barbara didn't need to hide her influence behind elegance. She could wield it openly, because the king himself made openness the style of the age. Barbara Palmer rose into Charles II's world at exactly the right moment, when the monarchy had been restored in 1660, and the court was rebuilding its identity. Charles II had spent years in exile. He returned not only as a king, but as a man determined never again to live under Puritan austerity. The court that formed around him became famous for wit, indulgence, performance, and scandal. Yet those words can make it sound like gossip. What mattered politically was simpler. If the king's personal life was the center of court life, then the people who controlled his personal life controlled the court's gravity. Barbara became one of the most prominent of Charles II's mistresses, and she did so in a way that made her impossible to ignore, not because she was merely beautiful, but because she was bold. In a palace full of people trained to flatter quietly, she had the rare ability to demand, and demanding is a form of power when the person you are demanding from hates resistance and loves gratification. Her title, Duchess of Cleveland, was not just decoration. In royal systems, titles are signals. They announce who has been lifted into the realm of official importance, and who is allowed to act as if they belong. When Barbara held that kind of status, it told everyone around the king that she was not a temporary amusement. She was a political reality. Courtiers might resent her, wives might despise her, ministers might fear her, but they still had to calculate around her. Because the king's attention is not evenly distributed, it pools, and where it pools, careers grow. This is the first mechanism that made Barbara dangerous. Asterisk, asterisk. She shaped access, asterisk, asterisk. In a court like Charles II's, where patronage could make or break fortunes, access to the king was the closest thing to currency. If Barbara could whisper a name, delay a meeting, poison an impression, or amplify a grudge, she could alter who rose and who fell. That doesn't require her to sign an order. It requires her to influence the emotion behind the order. And the people around her understood this with the clarity of desperate ambition. They didn't treat her as a mistress. They treated her as a gate. The second mechanism was asterisk, asterisk, transactional patronage. The sense that the court itself could be navigated through her. In many royal environments, the fastest path to influence is not competence but proximity. And Barbara sat close to the center. That meant gifts, favors, money, titles, and opportunities could flow towards those who pleased her, or those who bought her goodwill. This is where the economy forms, not a neat ledger of bribes, but a culture where people behave as if every relationship has a price, and the king's desire becomes the marketplace. The third mechanism, and perhaps the most psychologically brutal, was asterisk, asterisk, humiliation as power. In monarchy, reputation is a weapon. Court society runs on the fear of looking weak, foolish, or insignificant. A favorite who can embarrass people directly or indirectly can control them without even touching policy. And restoration culture was theatrical. People watched each other. They performed status constantly. In that environment, a woman who could turn attention into ridicule could turn ridicule into obedience. If you knew Barbara could destroy your standing with a sentence delivered in the wrong ear, you began to behave as if she mattered more than your own dignity. But the most fascinating part of Barbara's story is that it reveals the king's vulnerability in a way most royal narratives hide. Charles II was not a fool. He understood politics, he understood factions, he understood survival, yet he was also a man with appetites. And appetites create patterns. Once a court begins to predict the king's patterns, it learns how to steer him. And that is exactly why favorites can become so dangerous. They don't need to overpower a king, they simply need to become part of his routine. This is where the story stops being about Barbara as an individual and becomes about monarchy as a system. Because a system that relies on one person's private habits will always be unstable. Ministers can plan, parliaments can negotiate, generals can prepare, but one private argument, one jealousy, one indulgent evening can tilt the mood of the sovereign and change what he is willing to approve the next morning. That is the quiet terror behind courts. The state can turn on something as intimate as attention. Of course, there is always a limit. A favorite's power depends on the king continuing to choose them. And kings, especially charismatic kings like Charles II, rarely choose only one person for long. The court shifts, new faces arrive, factions move their bets, rival mistresses appear, influence becomes competitive, and the moment competition begins, the atmosphere turns poisonous, because everyone knows the truth. There is no safety in unofficial power, there is only continued access. So Barbara's danger wasn't simply what she did, it was what she represented, a court where intimacy became governance, and where governance became vulnerable to the most human forces: vanity, desire, fear of abandonment, the hunger to be chosen. That doesn't make her a caricature villain. It makes her a mirror of the Restoration Court's reality. She was not an intruder. She was an expression of what the monarchy had become in that era. And yet, as bold as Barbara's power was, it still existed inside one court, one king, one national mood. The next woman on our list is something else entirely, because she didn't merely exploit a king's habits. She became the habit. She didn't just influence the court. She was the court. Behind screens, behind protocols, behind a child emperor whose throne became her instrument. And once you step into the world of the Qing Palace and Empress Dowager Cixi, you'll see what dangerous looks like when a woman doesn't rely on romance at all, only on control, survival, and the ability to make herself impossible to remove. If the earlier women on this list show what happens when access becomes influence, Cixi shows what happens when influence becomes architecture, because her power did not depend on a king's affection, or a husband's devotion, or a court's taste for scandal. It depended on something far more durable: control of the system that decides who gets to speak, who gets to govern, and who gets to survive. Cixi began life far from the center of the world she would later dominate. She entered the Qing imperial palace as a concubine of the Shanfeng emperor, and that detail matters because it shaped her entire strategy. In courts, a wife may have status. A concubine has vulnerability. She is close enough to witness power but not protected by it. And in that position, the first rule is simple: if you do not secure your future, someone else will decide it for you. Her future changed in one decisive way. She gave birth to the emperor's son, who would become the Tongzhi emperor. In dynastic politics, a child can be a weapon, a shield, and a key. A mother of the heir is not merely a parent, she is a political asset. But assets in palaces attract predators. A mother can be honored publicly while being eliminated privately. So Cixi's first major achievement was not dramatic conquest. It was survival long enough to convert motherhood into authority. When the Shanfeng emperor died in 1861, China was in crisis. The empire had been shaken by internal upheaval and foreign pressure, and the throne passed to a child. That single fact created a vacuum, and the vacuum created a battle. Who would govern in the name of the boy? Who would hold the seals, issue edicts, sign decisions and control the flow of information? In monarchies, whoever governs for the ruler effectively governs the state. Cixi did not wait for permission. She moved. In 1861, she and the Empress Dowager Sian were associated with what is commonly described as a palace coup against the regency group appointed by the late emperor. The mechanics can sound technical, but the essence is sharp and simple. Cixi ensured that the boy emperor's reign would not be controlled by men who could later discard her. She positioned herself at the center of the regency, where she could see everything and decide what was real. This is where her method becomes clear. Cixi's power relied on two core skills: asterisk, asterisk, gatekeeping, asterisk, asterisk, adapterisk, 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 gatekeeping. First, she controlled access to the emperor, at first as a child, later as a symbol, and eventually as an adult whose authority could be contained. Whoever wanted influence had to approach the center, and the center was protected by layers of palace protocol. Cixi became the person those layers served. In practice, that meant ministers could be elevated or humiliated depending on proximity. Factions could be favored or frozen out. Information could be filtered before it reached decision-making. And because court life was both ceremonial and secretive, she could deny almost everything publicly. That is the genius of palace power. It is hard to prove, easy to feel, and nearly impossible to confront directly without risking your own position. Adaptation. Second, Cixi ruled for decades through changing conditions. Different emperors, different political crises, different foreign pressures. In many stories, a powerful regent collapses when circumstances shift. Cixi did the opposite. She shifted with them. That doesn't mean she was always modernizing or always reactionary. It means she remained central even as the empire's problems changed shape, and remaining central is often the only real definition of imperial success. Her reputation has been fought over for more than a century. Some portray her as an obstacle to reform, a figure who clung to tradition while the world changed. Others argue her position was more complex, that she navigated impossible pressures and maintained stability in an era where collapse was a constant threat. What matters for our purposes is not turning her into an angel or a villain. It's understanding why she belongs in a list of the most dangerous women near a throne. Because Cixi demonstrates a form of danger that is not emotional and not romantic. It is institutional. She could delay reforms. She could accelerate them. She could promote one faction and destroy another. She could punish rivals without needing to announce it as punishment. She could decide the rhythm of politics by controlling who was allowed to speak and when, and she did it for a very long time. Roughly half a century of dominance in one form or another. That longevity alone tells you something. Courts are built to remove threats, yet Cixi outlived threats, outmaneuvered them, and made herself a necessary part of the machine. There is also something psychologically chilling about her form of rule. When a favorite falls, it's visible. When a mistress is dismissed, it becomes gossip. When a regent controls the state, it becomes harder to tell where the sovereign ends and the regent begins. The emperor becomes a symbol. The symbol becomes the justification, and the person behind the symbol can claim they are merely protecting it. Cixi's power was also built on the palace's ability to turn privacy into governance. Decisions were not always made through open debate. They were made through memorials, audiences, small circles, and controlled rituals. If you control the ritual, you control the decision. And if you control the decision often enough, you control history. What makes her story feel especially relevant, even if you've never cared about Qing China before, is how universal her pattern is. Whenever a system concentrates legitimacy in one figure, the people who manage that figure become dangerously powerful. It happens in royal courts. It happens in dictatorships. It happens in any political architecture where a single body stands for the entire state. Cixi is a case study in what happens when a person understands that truth earlier and more clearly than everyone around them. And that brings us back to the heart of this video. These women were not dangerous because they broke rules in sensational ways. They were dangerous because they understood how the throne actually functions. That the throne is not only a chair, it is a network. That networks have weak points. that weak points are often human, and that the most effective power is the kind that doesn't need to announce itself. Isabella proved a queen could help remove a king. Catherine proved a mother of kings could steer a nation through terror. Diane proved devotion can become policy. Barbara proved desire can become a marketplace. And Cixi proved something even darker, that if you control access to the symbol of legitimacy long enough, you can become the state without ever wearing the crown yourself. And that is why history feared kings but consistently underestimated the women who were allowed close enough to shape them.